This happened in October of 2018. It was during a time when I was working at a riding stable. This is by far the freakiest thing that's ever happened to me. It started off with me mucking out stalls and taking horses in and out of pastures. Around 12:30 p.m., my mom came to pick me up from work. Since my shift begins at 8:30 a.m., I work the morning hours, then have the rest of the day off. As I got in the van with my mom, she said that she had driven past a cornfield a few streets down from the barn, and she had seen a clown. I asked her what the clown looked like, and she gave me a brief description. She said that it looked like Pennywise from It, the 2017 remake. She said she hadn't been able to get a clear view of it, but that's what she remembered it looking like. As soon as she said that, I questioned her about what street she had seen the clown at. She told me that the cornfield wasn't far from a trail, and I knew exactly what she was talking about. The trail she was talking about used to be a train track many years ago. But ever since the train track was removed, people used it for many other purposes, like hiking, dog walking, dirt biking, etc. My mom wanted to take the trail that was by the cornfield, the one where she had seen the clown. I was going to tell her that it wasn't a good idea, but she insisted that we do and take my dog there. My dog was a German Shepherd, Golden Retriever mix, and he was a few months old at the time. He wasn't really big, but he was always so rambunctious that we had to walk him every day. It was a pain to say the least, but fun too. My mom drove down a road that she took to drive me to and from work and riding. It was a quiet road, and it never got busy. When she got to the cornfield where the trail was, she parked her van, and we took my dog out. We didn't see the clown, but I wondered if he had run off to hide or something. We started walking down the trail. It was surrounded by trees, with leaves changing colors. It was fall, which was my mom's favorite season. As we walked down the trail, we let my dog go to run and do his own thing. After we were a few feet away from the van, I noticed a dirt bike on the ground. Upon getting closer, I looked to see that the bike had been there for a while. Unsure about if it was stolen or not, I noticed some damage done to it. The tires were slashed and the chain was broken. The bike seat was also ripped. I looked to see if there was anybody around, but couldn't see anyone. I figured whoever had left the bike was relieving themselves or something. My dog was staring at something in the wilted cornfield. I walked up to him and grabbed his leash to be safe. When I took hold of the leash, I looked up at the wilted cornfield. Winter was approaching within a few weeks, so it was normal to see most of the cornfields wilted in the area. I looked up to see a figure in the cornfield. That was what my dog was looking at. My mom was a couple of feet behind me. I could see that the figure looked like a clown, exactly as my mom had described seeing earlier. He looked to be about 6 feet tall. He was of a medium build, and as my mom had described earlier, he looked like Pennywise from the It remake. I wasn't sure why he was standing in the wilted cornfield, but I had no idea what his plans were. As I stared at the clown figure, it turned around to face me. I could see that the clown had an axe in his right hand. At this point, my heart's beating out of my chest. To the right of the clown, I could see at least 3 or 4 men dressed in black, just a few feet away. I was nearly pissing myself, wondering why those men were there. If it was private property or something, why couldn't they have just told us to leave? The clown slowly began to walk toward me and my dog. I almost froze in fear at that point. Suddenly, out of nowhere, there was a blood-curdling scream from somewhere in the forest. It sounded like a woman screaming, and I lost it right then and there. I booked it back the way I'd come with my dog, not looking back. When I caught up with my mom, I told her to run, and without question, she did. Despite my mom having breathing problems, we ran all the way back to our van. As soon as we got there, we looked back to see if the clown was behind us. There was no one following us, but we didn't want to stay to find out. My mom drove down the road until we got to our hometown, looking occasionally for any vehicle that might be suspicious. When we got back, we reported the incident to the police, and they went to the location where we had seen the clown. Shortly after that, we headed home without hesitation. The next day, my mom received a phone call from the police when she picked me up from work, and what they said will forever send chills down my spine. She told me that the clown, along with 3 or 4 other men, had been luring people down the trail we went to. They had found a few bodies of people, one of them being a 6-year-old girl. I was sick to my stomach, knowing those men were waiting for me, and possibly my mom and dog, in the field. If my dog hadn't alerted me and my mom about the clown and his men, I probably wouldn't be alive today. Let this be a warning. If you see anyone wearing a clown mask in the forest or a cornfield, run away as fast as you can. When I was around 11, in the early 2000s, my mom's friend gave us a gift on Valentine's Day. It was a wall decoration, a clown sitting on a wooden swing. The clown's body was made of cloth, and his head was ceramic. In general, he looked cute, so we didn't mind putting it on a wall. In the end, it was a gift, and we wouldn't just throw it away. I wasn't afraid of clowns at that point in time. Our house was basically a one-room apartment with a separate kitchen. My parents had just got together again, so we all slept in one room, which was also a TV room. The clown was right above my bed. Things started to get weird right away. I felt myself being observed in that room, and in the whole apartment. I was uncomfortable. I started to have sleeping problems, a lot of nightmares, and they were violent. I wasn't a fan of horror movies, and I didn't consume any scary content. This uncomfortable living continued. Once, I woke up at night and immediately got the feeling of being watched. My dog was sleeping with me in a bed frequently, and I looked at her. She was looking up at the clown. I freaked out. I started to pet her, and she completely ignored me. I was poking her and got zero reaction, as if she was hypnotized. At some point, she came back. I hugged her and couldn't sleep the rest of the night. I didn't talk to my parents about the clown because it only bothered me, and I thought, it's in my head. The next morning I decided I'd had enough, and before school I talked to the clown. I said that I hated him, and I'd throw him away if he didn't stop. That was sort of a power moment. In the back of my mind, I laughed at myself for believing in it. That day my mom told me that she needed to go to the train station and meet her friend who would be staying overnight at our place. My dad was on a business trip, so I had to stay home alone after school until around 8 p.m. I was scared, of course, but it seemed to be going okay while it was daylight. I watched cartoons and some teenage series. The sun started to go down, and I thought, I need to turn on the light. I reached out to the lamp, and it didn't work. The switch also didn't work. So I decided to turn on the light in the corridor. Again, the switch didn't work. I thought I was going to die from my heart racing like crazy. I was scared to go to the kitchen. I was paralyzed by fear. I thought to myself, I'll just sit on the sofa and watch TV, and nothing will happen to me. The same second, I see in my peripheral vision that one of the clown's legs sort of moved and slightly bounced against the wall. I told myself I'm just too scared, and there's nothing wrong. It's my imagination. It's just a toy. What happened next? I have no idea. It's a complete blackout for me. According to my mom, she came back home with her friend and rang the doorbell. I didn't open. They called on the home phone, and I didn't pick up. They went down to ask the concierge if she had seen something. The dog was barking like crazy, and they could hear it through the 2 entrance doors. There was a light in the room which they could see from the balcony. They say it lasted for about 30 minutes before they called emergency to break into the apartment, and around 10 minutes for them to arrive. Lastly, I sort of woke up as my dog was poking me with her cold nose in my face and hands. All I remember is there was light everywhere. My dog was jumping on me and barking. The phone was ringing constantly, and people were knocking on the door, screaming my name. It was chaos. Another thing, I was lying on a pillow under the blanket, as if I had gone to sleep. When I opened the door, my mom and her friend were hysterically crying. They thought I was dead or something. I told them I was watching TV, and I probably fell asleep so deep that I didn't hear anything. It was around 10 p.m. after we ate and prepared for bed. I slept in a bed with my mom and her friend. I didn't tell them anything about the clown because I was just so stressed about the whole thing. In the morning, her friend told us that she felt very uncomfortable and couldn't fall asleep because she felt she was being watched. Then she pointed to the clown and said it was creepy. That's when I told them that the last thing I remembered was the clown's leg moving before I passed out. We all got horrible chills. The next morning, I went to school. My mom threw that clown away, somewhere far away from our area. It would have been great if she told me about this beforehand, because when I came home from school and didn't see the toy, I started to spin around thinking, this thing standing behind me with a knife. When I realized it wasn't there anymore, I sat near the open entrance doors and waited for my mom to come back from work. That was the last I ever saw of the clown. This is something that happened to my great-granddad, and he swears that it's true. A quick bit of background. My great-granddad lived in a very remote village in Pakistan, where they had no electricity, no TV, no proper schools, so really no exposure to the outside culture. Their stories of the kings and queens featured a comedian and never a clown. I'll tell you why this is relevant shortly. His routine involved waking up really early in the morning, before sunrise, to go to the fields early enough, as most people in the village back then could only travel by walking or on a camel. So this one morning, he woke up and, after breakfast, left the house when it was still dark. Since there were no streetlights back then, all he had was a lantern for light, which he held in one hand, and walked, looking down to avoid stepping on a snake. The village is in a desert, so finding snakes is quite common. Because it was quite early, the streets were completely deserted. Anyway, he had barely made it to the middle of his street when he heard the sound of bells ahead of him. It made him lift his lantern a bit higher and look up. According to him, as his eyes traveled up from the ground, he noticed a pair of feet wearing bright orange and red striped shoes with curved toes and bells on the ends. He continued looking up and saw a pair of legs, a torso, arms, and a head, covered from head to toe in the same orange and red striped outfit with ruffles around the neck and sleeves. My great-granddad noticed that on the head, this being was wearing a hat that had 3 pointy ends, with bells on each end. But there was no face, just a black mass where the face should have been. As soon as my great-granddad looked at this thing's face, it literally disappeared right in front of him. He ran back home and was freaked out for days after that. Now I need to remind everyone again that my great-granddad had never even heard of what a clown looked like. His description was so accurate that I instantly asked, "Did it look like a clown?" And he said, "I don't know what a clown is or looks like." It might sound strange to some people, but the village my great-granddad lived in is still way behind the times. The concept of Joker or clowns in a circus or birthday parties is still pretty much foreign to them. I know that a lot of people, including me before I heard this story from my great-granddad, have a phobia of clowns. A lot of the time we try to explain the fear saying things like, "It's because you can't see what's under the makeup," or "Some clowns have a sinister look about them." But for someone who had never even heard of a clown, seeing one in such clear, vivid detail is incredible, and I'm kind of starting to believe that maybe the fear of clowns isn't just because they look weird. Maybe it's because the concept of clowns did come from something paranormal. Clowns. I'm afraid of the word. I never want to hear the word. On Halloween, I don't even come out of the house in fear of seeing him, the clown, or any clown. I'll start by telling you that I used to love the circus growing up. I went to every circus and parade when I was a kid. You could always find me celebrating and laughing with my friends. We couldn't help but notice there was one clown that would always be at every parade. He'd do tricks like walking on stilts or juggling. We knew it was always the same clown because he had these evil, deep blood red eyes and weird teeth. He wasn't like the others, and he was always there on Halloween. They were goofy and old. He was always young, maybe in his 20s. I don't know. He could do anything and do it better than all of the rest. And he always smiled at us, picking us out in the crowd. As I grew older, I stopped going to the circus because I started to love football and sports. Then I went to college, got a job, you know the rest. I just grew out of it. Then, one Halloween day, my company took us all to the circus for a company team building event. I hadn't been to the circus in ages and had forgotten all about that evil clown. He was the last thing on my mind when I walked into the big tent. But there he was. The clown show was first. All of the clowns doing their silly acts for the patrons, while they ignored him. They always ignored him. He was juggling knives, of all things. Big machetes. As one clown walked by him, one of the machetes came down on the clown's arm and sliced it off. He screamed as it dropped to the ground and grabbed the shoulder socket from where it was torn. Blood spewed between his fingertips. The clown ran, screaming from the tent as his arm twitched on the ground. No one else flinched. No one noticed. Was it an illusion? As I stood and stared, the evil clown looked up in my direction and winked at me. He read my screaming mind. It was impossible. His smile turned into a razor-sharp grin, with teeth as jagged as hunting knives, just like when I was young. No one else noticed. They all laughed at the clowns and how they tripped and entertained. No one saw the evil one staring at me. A bit queasy, I sat down and pondered on this thought. How? How in the hell was this guy still young? He was already 20 years my senior when I was 10. It had to be the makeup. But there he was doing the same flips and jumps that he did years ago, and still picking me out in the crowd with those evil eyes. My stomach churned like I was going to hurl. On weak legs, I stood and made my way through the laughing crowd, hoping to make it to the exit before I passed out. As the fresh air filled my lungs when I exited, I felt a little better, at least enough to get curious. I looked around and saw him, only him, making his way to his smaller tent. Sadly, curiosity got the best of me, and I followed. When he reached his tent, he opened the flap and turned to look at me. With one hand, he motioned for me to come inside. I could have said anything but yes, but I didn't. My mind raced with fear and anticipation as I stepped into the tent. It looked way bigger inside than it did outside. There were rooms and strange moaning noises coming from them. It had to be an illusion of some sort. "Come, sit. Would you like some tea?" He pulled a chair out from the table. The centerpiece was a small pumpkin carved in a clown's face and glowing with a hypnotizing fire, an almost black fire. Reluctantly, I nodded. I assumed the caffeine would clear my head a little, so I didn't say no. He came back a few minutes later with some mint-flavored tea and told his story. "I'm old, older than you know. Everything here is an illusion, and no one but you and your friends can see me. You created me out of your feeble little mind. How can I be sitting here drinking this tea if I created you? Only you can answer that," he laughed. "Then where am I right now?" I started to grow really tired, and my eyelids began to shut. I tried to focus on the glowing light of the tiny jack-o'-lantern before me, but it just made the fatigue worse. "You're right here, with me," he smirked and continued. "No one can see you. You're like a figment of their imagination right now." I felt my chin drop to my chest. Then as I came to, everything was bigger. The smell of mint tea flooded my senses as I realized I was in the teacup that I was drinking from. Heavy footsteps patted the ground, and the chair I was in squeaked beside me. That hideous razor-sharp grin now blocked my view of the tapered tent's top. I think I screamed. I'm not sure. He raised the cup to his lips, and as the liquid started to pour into his mouth, I went with it. My fingers slipped as I tried to grab onto the side of the cup. I hit his pursed lips, and I tried to grab those too, but they were too supple. I tried to grab at his teeth, but only screamed as one of my fingers bounced across my view when his jagged tooth cut into it and sliced it off. I wrapped my arms around the tip of his tongue, watching the liquid fall down the dark tube of death as he swallowed the tea. The sound of his voice was loud inside his mouth. He shook his tongue back and forth until I lost my grasp on the slimy muscle and fell onto the soft pads of his saliva glands. There was so much spit in his mouth, and even more as my limbs flailed and activated them. The tip of his tongue pushed underneath me and prodded me to the top of his mouth. He was toying with me, pushing me up against the roof of his mouth and making me bounce up and down on his tongue like a trampoline. "Please let me go," I screamed. "I'll do anything. What do you want?" His laugh echoed in my ears as he began to tilt his head backward and swallow. I made one last attempt to grab at his disgusting uvula and wrap my body around it. He didn't gag or choke like I expected. He just shook his head violently until I slid down the slippery organ and into his throat. I could feel the muscles of his esophagus working around me, pushing me down into the pit of hell where I knew I'd be mashed by stomach muscles while being eaten away by acid. I cried as my body bounced down into the humid, smelly pit of his gut. It was dark and hot. I stood, and the little bit of tea he swallowed swarmed around my ankles. I pounded on his stomach walls, screaming to let me out, as a large, smelly gas bubble swept by me and exited through the top. I heard him burp, and then felt warmth squirting out in my clothes as they seemed to melt off my body. Then it stopped. It was silent. My skin was burned with stomach acid where the clothes didn't protect me. The heat of the pit made me sleepy, despite the pain in my skin. I sunk down in defeat into the hot tea and acid mix, feeling my skin begin to burn and drift away. I suddenly awoke in my bed, sweating and screaming, with my cell phone blaring in my ear. My maniacal laugh was probably heard throughout my apartment building. It was all a dream. I grabbed the phone and stared at the unknown number. Before answering, I looked down at my legs. There were red burn marks in my skin, on my ankles, and I was wearing pajamas I didn't recognize. To my horror, my index finger was cut up and wrapped in bandages. I slowly pressed the button to answer the call. Hello? Hello, Stephen. The clown's cheery voice danced in my head. Let's do it again next Halloween.